Over the past year, headlines about the South China Sea have exploded across global media. Viral clips, Coast Guard confrontations, laser incidents, water cannon standoffs, most of it centered on one flashpoint, Scarborough Shoal. The arguments were loud. The diplomatic notes were public. Every confrontation between Manila and Beijing turned into instant global content. But here is the question almost nobody is asking. What if the real move was not happening at Scarborough Shoal at all? What if, while the cameras were pointed at one patch of water, the strategic chessboard in the South China Sea was being quietly rearranged somewhere else? Because that is exactly what may be happening. And the place is not a household name. It is a small sandbar in the Paracel Islands, a place barely mentioned in mainstream Western media, known in Chinese as Kuangzai Shazhou, and located near what Western nautical charts label as Antelope Reef. Yes, the same Antelope Reef we discussed in our previous video. Recent high-resolution satellite imagery shows renewed activity. Dredgers. Construction platforms, sole reshaping of land. No announcement. No dramatic speech. No press conference. Just engineering. And in geopolitics, engineering can be louder than rhetoric. To understand why this matters, we need to zoom out. When people hear of China's island building in the South China Sea, they usually think of the dramatic phase between 2013 and 2016. Massive dredgers. Runways carved out of coral. Deep water ports rising from reefs. Names like Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, and Mischief Reef became global shorthand for artificial islands. In Western media narratives, these were militarized outposts transforming the maritime balance of power. In Chinese narratives, they were sovereign infrastructure projects within national territory. Either way, they were loud, visible, and controversial. But while the Spratly Islands dominated headlines, the Paracels appeared relatively settled. China has controlled the Paracel Islands since 1974, following a naval clash with South Vietnam. The administrative center sits on Woody Island, known in Chinese as Yongxing Dao. Today, Woody Island has a 3,000-meter runway, deep water port facilities, government buildings, residential housing, and a permanent military presence. It resembles a functioning township more than a remote outpost. So why return to a tiny sand cay in the Western Paracels? Because the logic has changed. Earlier construction was about expanding the footprint. What we may be seeing now is about tightening gaps. Strengthening weak links. And those weak links are not hypothetical. Manila's increasingly assertive moves near Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal have drawn global attention. But something else has been happening with far less media noise. Vietnam has been building. Quietly. Steadily. And significantly. Vietnam occupies around 29 features in the Spratly Islands. For years, its facilities were modest compared to China's artificial islands. But since around 2021, satellite imagery analyzed by organizations such as the Center for Strategic and International Studies has shown accelerating Vietnamese land reclamation and fortification. The most striking example is at Antelope Reef. Vietnam has extended its runway to over 3,000 meters. That length supports more than light aircraft. It could accommodate fighter jets like Vietnam's Russian-made Su-30s. Even heavy transport aircraft depend on configuration. Other features, including Pearson Reef and Nam Island, have seen harbor expansion, hardened shelters, reinforced seawalls, and new radar systems. Estimates suggest Vietnam has added hundreds of acres of reclaimed land in recent years. While comparisons with China's earlier megaprojects can be misleading, one trend is undeniable. Vietnam's engineering tempo has increased. And it has done so without triggering the same international backlash China faced a decade ago. The strategy is clear. If you cannot match scale, you improve resilience. You harden what you hold. You reduce vulnerability. You create facts not on paper but on reefs. That is not symbolic politics. It is geometry. Lay out the Paracels on a map. A pattern emerges. The northeastern Amphitrite group, anchored by Woody Island, concentrates administrative and air power. Move west toward the Crescent Group and density thins. There sits Zhongjian Island, also known in some English sources as Triton Island. It lies roughly 330 kilometers from Da Nang, Vietnam. That proximity matters. Reports suggest radar upgrades and surveillance enhancements have been installed there. But Zhongjian Island has a vulnerability. Isolation. It is distant from Hainan, China's main southern military hub, and separated from Woody Island. In modern missile-era warfare, isolated outposts are liabilities. And this is where Kuangzai Shazhou becomes strategically interesting. Located roughly 85 kilometers from Zhongjian Island, it falls within what military planners sometimes call a support radius. Close enough for helicopter transit, overlapping radar coverage, and maritime resupply. Far enough to create a layered defense. If expanded and stabilized, Kuangzai Shazhou could function as a logistics node, a radar platform, a UAV base, a helicopter staging ground, or a distributed missile platform. Instead of a single exposed sentinel, you create a triangle. Woody Island in the northeast. Zhongjian is in the southwest. Kuangzai Shazhou in between. A triangle not drawn on paper but built on water. China's posture in the South China Sea has evolved. Between 2013 and 2016, construction surged. That period triggered diplomatic pushback, U.S. freedom of navigation operations, and the 2016 arbitration ruling rejecting China's 9-line claims, a ruling Beijing rejected. After that peak, large-scale dredging slowed. The focus shifted to consolidation. Normalization. Hardening. Now, activity at Antelope Reef signals something more subtle. Optimization. Not an expansion for spectacle, but reinforcement for resilience. In maritime strategy, the network often matters more than the biggest base. A web of nodes creates persistent surveillance. Overlapping radar. Layered defense. A ship may legally pass through international waters. But if it knows it is constantly observed and potentially within missile range, strategic calculus changes. It is not about blocking transit. It is about shaping behavior. Stretch the map eastward. From the Paracels to Scarborough Shoal. Historically, this northern South China Sea corridor felt open. U.S. carrier strike groups. Japanese oil tankers. Commercial shipping. Open water. But as infrastructure nodes multiply, perception changes. Scarborough Shoal, controlled by China since 2012, anchors the eastern side. The Paracels anchor the west. Between them lies a corridor that may increasingly shift from open commons to continuously observed space. Legal status and operational reality are not identical. International law may define EEZ boundaries. Military planners think in terms of detection range and response time. Kuangzai Shazhou may be small. But small nodes alter geometry. This development has neighboring countries watching closely. Japan, for example, is not a claimant in the South China Sea. But roughly 80 to 90% of Japan's imported oil transits these waters after passing through the Strait of Malacca. For Tokyo, this is not an abstract dispute. It is an economic oxygen line. For decades, the South China Sea was treated as a global commons. Incremental fortification does not necessarily block trade. But it embeds leverage. In peacetime, flows remain open. In crisis, uncertainty grows. That uncertainty changes strategic calculations. There is also a symbolic dimension. Western charts preserve colonial-era names like Antelope Reef, derived from a 19th-century British vessel. China uses Kuangzai Shazhou, rooted in its own maritime lexicon. When infrastructure rises, narrative solidifies. Concrete reinforces claims. Flags shape perception. Sovereignty disputes are not resolved by dredgers alone. But presence influences diplomacy. What stands out about the current phase is the tone. No grand ceremony. No dramatic unveiling. Just gradual construction. Strategic signaling is not always verbal. Sometimes it is infrastructural. Instead of contesting Vietnam's Spratly upgrades directly, reinforcing the Paracel network strengthens China's defensive lattice. It is not an argument. It is architecture. Vietnam's submarine fleet, including Kilo-class boats, relies on maneuvering space and stealth. Denser radar coverage narrows those margins. Air operations become more complex when detection zones overlap. It does not mean conflict is inevitable. But it does mean the chessboard is denser. What we are witnessing may be maturation. Earlier disputes centered on legality and historical narrative. Now the focus is on implementation. Engineering. Logistics. Network resilience. For China, reinforcing the Paracels suggests a show of confidence. For Vietnam, Spratly upgrades signal determination. For the Philippines, balancing alliances remains delicate. For the United States, freedom of navigation operations require calibration. For Japan and ASEAN states, stability is paramount. Great power competition is not always loud. Sometimes it is incremental. Offense is rarely dramatic. But once solid, it shapes behavior. Kuangzai Shazhou will not become a metropolis. It will not rival Woody Island. But as a node in a layered network, it may alter operational math. The South China Sea today is less about sudden seizures. More about precision placement. In chess, decisive moves are often quiet. A piece is placed carefully. Options are constrained gradually. Whether Kuangzai Shazhou becomes that piece remains to be seen. Satellite imagery shows early signs. Runway grading. Pier foundations. Radar masts. The broader trend is visible. The contest is no longer about who shouts louder. It is about who shapes the board more precisely. And in geopolitics, precision often speaks the loudest.